Welcome back to my YouTube series where I cover all of the topics in the Palo Alto Network's Next Generation Firewall Engineer certification. In today's video, I will be covering the Global Protect gateways, and this will be the third and final video in our section on Global Protect. In the previous video, I have covered a very basic Global Protect installation or setup from scratch, and I also covered the Global Protect portals. I have covered the basics of authentication, but I will actually have an entire lesson on authentication once we get to section 2.1, and then the other subtask under Global Protect is split tunneling, which I will also cover today. If you have never set up Global Protect before, I highly recommend you watch part 1 of the Global Protect section of this series so that you can go see a basic Global Protect setup before understanding some of the settings that we are going to show today. Let's begin. Before we get started, I'd like to confront the elephant in the room, and that is that I am wearing a Seahawks Hawaiian shirt. So some of you might be wondering, is Wes a Seahawks fan? I thought in the past he had said that he's a Jaguars fan, and maybe some of you have seen my videos where I talk about being a Jaguars fan and us always losing. But I am what we refer to here in the United States as a bandwagon fan or a fair weather fan, which basically means I have a few teams, which are the Seahawks, the Jaguars, and the Commanders. And whichever one of those is doing well, I will support, especially during the playoffs if they make the playoffs. The Commanders and Jaguars did not do as well. Commanders not really at all, and Jaguars did good for the Jaguars this year. But the Seahawks had a great season. Obviously, they won the Super Bowl, so I jumped on that bandwagon and supported the Seahawks. My dad is from the Pacific Northwest, not far from Seattle, actually. And therefore, on his side of the family, we have a lot of Seahawks supporters, and I received a lot of gifts of Seahawks memorabilia, etc. when I was a kid. And actually 11 years ago, I was a much bigger Seahawks fan when they had some of their best years 11 years ago and actually lost to the Patriots, who they beat yesterday in the Super Bowl. Now, some of you are probably wondering why I'm still talking about football right now, because you came here to learn about the Palo Alto Network's Next Generation Firewall and prepare for your certification. So I will stop talking about football and we can now talk about Global Protect gateways. The Global Protect gateway is going to be the actual thing that you're going to access in order to pivot into the applications that you are using when you are connected to Global Protect. Whether that is connecting into internal applications or pivoting through Global Protect in order to connect back to the internet, you are going to need to connect to a gateway. A gateway is going to be that actual tunnel that you're setting up between the client and the firewall, and so that the firewall can then basically proxy your connections to the internal server or to the internet. It is different from the portal. The portal, as I mentioned before, is more delivering those agent settings, but part of what the portal is delivering is the different gateways, whether that's going to be the internal gateways or the external gateways. And then once the client machine receives those gateways, it will connect in and then to the gateway, and then now it can use that gateway to proxy the connection into the applications. As I mentioned in the introduction, one of the specific callouts of the gateways of the certification is split tunneling. So I will cover that today. So just make sure that you pay attention to that. Whenever those things are specifically called out, it means there's likely to be quite a few questions on that in the certification exam. So make sure that you specifically understand tunneling. I also will go through authentication more or less the same amount that I went through the portals, but I will not be covering the specifics of an authentication profile because section 2.1 of the Palo Alto Network's Next Generation Firewall Engineer certification covers authentication profiles specifically, so we'll go in much more detail once we get to that section. Anyway, let's actually get into the configuration so you can learn more about how gateways work, and let's switch to the firewall. This is my virtual firewall that I have set up in Amazon Web Services. To see the gateway configurations, we will go to Network, and you see I already have it clicked here, Gateways, and you'll see this is the gateway that I set up in the first part of the Global Protect videos. So let's look at some of these settings. We have the general settings, which are going to include the network settings just as it did for the portal. And this is going to be exactly like the portal. You're going to select which interface you want to expose the gateway on. In my case, I have it in the same interface as I have the portal. I have the portal and the gateway on the same interface. They do not need to be on the same interface. They don't even need to be on the same firewall. You can have a portal that pushes out gateways that exist on other firewalls, and this is very, very common. I've seen many customers who have 1 or 2 portals. They have a set of, say, half a dozen VPN firewalls. 1 or 2 of them are both portals and gateways, and the rest are only gateways. And then those 2 portals advertise all of the others as gateways. So that's very, very common. Then you have to set up some kind of load balancing between them. Just as with the portal, you can do IPv4, IPv6, or dual stack. Nothing complicated there. And then here you're going to see this IPv4 address, which is going to be the IP address in my case that I am exposing this gateway on. For log settings, it is the same exact log settings as it was in the portal. You can log a successful SSL handshake, an unsuccessful handshake, or you can perform log forwarding. I did open the log forwarding menu in the, what am I zoomed into? Oh yeah, let me zoom in. Oops, let's move this. Here we go. I did open the log forwarding menu in the previous video on portals, and I probably should not have done that because there actually will be a whole lesson also on log forwarding in this YouTube series. So just know that you can select the log forwarding here. According to the documentation, these 2 are specific to decryption logs. So this will be decryption logs for a successful SSL handshake or an unsuccessful SSL handshake, whether or not you want to log successful or unsuccessful. And that is partially why it's much more common to only log unsuccessful, because you're really only logging when you're having those decryption issues because the SSL handshake was not able to complete. Let's move on to authentication. As you will see, this is very, very similar to the portal one. You'll notice one difference here. So if I go back and I go to the portals, hit authentication, you'll notice there is no block quarantine down here. But here, they have block login for quarantine devices. I will explain that in a second, but first let's just review some of these things. So first, because the GlobalProtect gateway does have the ability to do a TLS tunnel, you want to select which your TLS service profile for exposing TLS through your gateway, what certificate will be presented, as well as the private key that will be used to encrypt communication with the client. As you can see, since I have just selected the same profile that I did for the portal in my case. You can select a different one if you'd like. Your gateway profile might be different from your portal profile. For example, maybe you have, portal.wesleycyber.me as your portal address, but then you have, gateway 1, gateway 2.wesleycyber.me as your different gateway addresses. It's actually very common. Going on to client authentication, you will see all of the same options here. So you have a name, you can change the client authentication depending on OS. So if you want a different authentication profile per operating system, then you can do that. You can select which operating system. I'm not going to go into details here. You can see here extended authentication. I will go through that in a second when we get to the extended authentication setting, but that is an option for operating system. So it's not really detecting operating system. It's just basically saying, well, I can't see the operating system because it's using extended authentication. So if you want to have a authentication profile specific to extended authentication, then you can do that. The authentication profile, as I mentioned, this will be covered in section 2.1. So I'm not going to cover the specifics of how to make an authentication profile here. Just recall that I'm using the local database, which, as I've mentioned in the past, is a set of usernames and password hashes that are stored locally on the firewall for authentication. You have also the option here, just as we had with the portal, to automatically retrieve passcode from soft token application, which is very commonly used when people are using RSA and they want to be able to put the RSA pin directly in to the login as basically the password for logging into the Global Protect, in this case, the Global Protect Gateway. So that is an option. What you do not have here is you do not have the option to select default browser. So that is not an option for the gateway. With the portal, you had the ability to select embedded versus default browser. Global Protect app login screen, you have the same options. It's kind of interesting to me that it's separate, right, between the app login screen between the portal and the gateway, so you can change the username and password labels. You probably want these the same, I imagine, in general, but also you probably just want to use the authentication cookie so that you don't need to log in twice, both to your portal and then your gateway, which I'll show in a second. But if you want to customize the username, as we did in the previous one, to corporate email, then you can do that. As I mentioned in the previous video, most of the people I know who write these certifications don't really care too much about these aesthetic things. They're going to build hard networking questions to try to get you to problem solve during the certification. If you want to force people to log in, both with the user credentials, basically the credentials for this authentication profile, as well as the client certificate, then you need to select no here, which is the default. No here, which is the default, which requires both the user credentials, so both logging in with this authentication profile, as well as a client certificate, which is a certificate presented by the client system, has to be presented for that user. Then you would select both of these. If you just want the user credentials or the client certificate, then you can select yes here. If we hit cancel, if you want to do any kind of client certificate, so if you select no there, or if you just want people to be able to log in directly with the client certificate without putting in user credentials, then you need to add a certificate profile down here, where you have the certificate authorities in this profile, which would sign the certificate, which would be presented by that user. Again, this is the same settings as portal. The one difference is this block login for quarantine devices. So you do have the ability to prevent someone from connecting to the gateway if their device is on the quarantine list. That quarantine list exists. Hit cancel here. So if we go to device and scroll down to device quarantine, as you can see, you can add them manually with a host ID and serial number. You can also set up log forwarding to have an action which quarantines devices when specific criteria are met. And so when I cover log forwarding, I will explain that, but this is where you can see the device quarantine list. And if you have logic set up that adds devices to this quarantine list, then it will prevent them from logging into the Global Protect Gateway if you have this option checked, which is checked by default. Moving on to the agent. So somewhat similar to the portal, this is the sort of agent settings. This is going to be very different from the agent settings in the sense of this has nothing to do with like, can you disable the app or things like that. This has more to do with the actual agent's connection into the gateway, right? It makes sense because the gateway is less about receiving app settings and it is more about the actual network connection into your firewall and then pivoting into your internal applications or your internet applications. First, you have the option to check tunnel mode, which I did check. I generally am going to recommend tunnel mode, but tunnel mode basically allows you to, instead of just connecting in and then coming from the interface that you've connected into. So for example, if I wasn't using tunnel mode, it would just, all my connections would just seem like they're coming from interface 1/1 because that's where Global Protect portal is, or Global Protect, I have to correct myself, Global Protect Gateway is. Instead, it basically tunnels, so it creates this sort of virtual, I hate to use that word virtual interface, but this sort of simulated interface, this tunnel, and it has all the traffic come from this it's basically a virtual interface that's within the firewall, a logical interface, let's say that. So it's a logical tunnel interface that's within the firewall and it has all the traffic that's coming from this tunnel interface. What's great about that is now I can assign a different zone. So everything's tying back together, so I can tie a specific zone to that interface. So if you remember the lessons on interfaces and zones, if you haven't watched those, go watch them. But now it's the traffic is coming from that specific tunnel interface, and now I can tie a specific zone to that tunnel interface. So now you can see how everything's coming together, right? So I can have a zone that's called GP-users, which is what I have here. Let's go look at it. GP-users. And then if I go to the interface, the tunnel interface, you'll see the zone, security zone that is tied to that tunnel is GP-users. So now I want to basically have a separate zone just for GP users, and I want them to have their own interface so that I can control traffic for GlobalProtect. So I highly recommend, pretty much always you're going to want to use tunnel mode. You don't have to use it. You can uncheck it, and then it will just be coming from that interface that you're accessing, that you've exposed the GlobalProtect gateway on. But I would recommend not doing that. You can put the maximum number of users here for the tunnel if you'd like. You can. It's funny. It's like enable IPsec. Enable IPsec is checked by default. You can disable IPsec. So if you want to only use the TLS tunnel, then you can do that. Recommend using IPsec. There's been a lot of issues across. I haven't really seen it in Palo Alto. I've just seen a lot of security issues across various devices with TLS tunnels. So I highly recommend using IPsec whenever possible. And what's great about this is you can create a IPsec crypto profile where you can select the specific encryption algorithms that you're going to allow yourself to use, as well as authentication here. So you can limit those. All right, I promised you that I would tell you about extended authentication support. So extended authentication support is kind of cool because since it's like an open source protocol or an open source standard, it allows you to connect clients that are not the GlobalProtect client into the GlobalProtect VPN, the GlobalProtect gateway. This is very, very commonly used by people who have like iPhones and Androids, and they want to connect the native VPN that exists on that device into Palo Alto Networks GlobalProtect, into the gateway. And so in that case, you can select enable here. You don't have to fill out a group name and group password here. This is a thing that's specific to extended authentication. But if you set these, it will basically do a two-step, not like the dance two-step, but like a two-step authentication where first the user has to input the proper group name and group password, and then they will have to log in as their user as well. And you can skip authentication on Ike rekey. So every time that Ike does a rekey, you won't need to authenticate if you want to check that option. So those are the tunnel settings. Moving on to the client settings, we configured some of these earlier. These are config selection criteria, so very similar to the portal. You can create different client settings here based on configuration selection criteria. Am I really going to do that? Oh, let's just keep doing it. So, for example, the really simple example I keep doing, right? Client settings, Android. If there's a question about client settings per operating system on the certification, I did not help write the certification, by the way, so I have no clue if that's a question or not. But you guys better get it right because I have beat this one to death here. And then we could even change the IP pool. Let's do 60 here because it was Super Bowl 60 that the Seahawks won yesterday. All right, so we got 67, 60. All right, so you can see if it's an Android, it's going to be a different IP pool, 67 versus Windows, it'll be 60. Different settings. So that's how that works. You can do that based on operating system. You can do it based on source user. You know, based on region and source address. So you can say, hey, if you're from a different country, look at this. You can say if you're from Canada, you get a different IP address than people from the United States or whatever. These are config selection criteria. A lot less config selection criteria than you had for the portal. Really just user, operating system, region, IP address. Let's delete that. All right, moving on. Authentication override. We covered this with the portal. Again, I recommend that you accept the cookie for the authentication override if you generated it, especially if you generated in the portal, but I recommend you generate in the portal and then accept it here. If you want, you can actually, another thing that you can do is you can generate it here and accept it here So if you want to, you can kind of force the user to log in twice. I've seen this before where you force the user to log in twice initially. So first they log into the portal and then they log into the gateway. And then what this will do is this will basically generate the cookie for this, like for the access to the gateway in the future for as long as you allow the cookie to go. So you can, I mean, you could do 365 days. You could have that cookie last for a year. It sounds funny when I say it, like you could have that cookie last for a year, and then you just select that certificate that you want to encrypt, decrypt. If you're pushing from, you know, a portal to a gateway, you're going to need to make sure that the certificate is the same across the two, and that you have the certificate imported in both your portal and gateway firewalls so that it sees the same certificate. All right. Moving on to IP pools. So you can configure an IP pool from the here in the config, and then you can actually also do it across the entire gateway itself. So you can do it sort of per agent config or in the entire, or for the entire gateway. I'll show you that in a second. But here you can see there's also this option to retrieve a framed IP address attribute from authentication server. This is something that is specific to Radius. If you're using a Radius server, you can basically get this framed IP address attribute, and then that will allow you to sort of set those specific IPs within that Radius server, if that makes sense. And then it'll receive that, and then it will be able to specify the IP from the server itself. So you can check this, and then you can add in, if you want, the authentication server IP pool specific to that, if you are receiving this framed IP address attribute from the authentication server. That's a Radius specific thing. We're going to keep this IP pool here. This is a set of IPs that they're going to assign, right? So if a user logs in with an Android, they're going to get, the first user is going to get 192.168.67.1, and then user number 2 is going to get 192.168.67.2, etc. And it will be persistent for some time. So when the user logs back in for some time, they'll continue to get that IP address, but they will drop off, and then eventually it'll just assign the new user the next IP address. All right, split tunneling. As I mentioned, this is specifically called out in the certification documentation. So make sure you know this very, very well. First, you have this option to do no direct access to local network. What does that mean? Does that mean that the person can't access your internal network? No, that is not what that means. What that means is that if the person is working from home and they have a printer connected to their home network, and you select this, then when their VPN is on, they are not going to be able to print they're not gonna be able to print because they're not able to access their local network. They're not able to access those things on that sort of on their local Wi-Fi in that case, probably. Because you selected this, because their Global Protect is preventing them from doing that. However, that is not true and yeah, you can see it's only applicable to Windows, Mac, and Linux. So even if you select this and you have the Global Protect app installed on your iPhone, for example, this won't work because that functionality doesn't work there. However, this will not apply if you have split tunneling enabled. Something important to know. So if you do this, but you are still allowing split tunneling, then the split tunneling will still work. So if you're not familiar with split tunneling, I mean, I guess it's a little bit of a basic network concept, but basically what split tunneling means is you're not forcing everything through the VPN, right, through the gateway. So you can select what you want to go through the gateway. By default, you're having this off, and then you have nothing here, right? So by default, everything on the local network can be accessed and just goes through the local network, does not go through the VPN, and everything else goes through the VPN. However, if you want to do split tunneling, so say for example, you want to, just so you know, it's kind of confusing because include and exclude here, it's not include like in split tunneling, it's include in the tunnel traffic, right? So if it says include, then this is including, so anything that you put here, so if like you put 10.5.0.67.0/24, what this means is anything directed for this subnet is going to go through the tunnel. It will go through the tunnel. Exclude means if you put like 192.168.2.0/24, now it will exclude any traffic destined for this subnet from the tunnel. So if there's some kind of traffic and the destination address in the packet is in this subnet, it's not going to go through the tunnel. It's going to go, through the just direct to internet, basically. It's not going to go through the Global Protect tunnel at all. That's what split tunneling is. So it's very common that, it can be common if you're like, hey, when people are accessing this remote site, we want them to be able to access a specific IP range. But what's a lot more common for split tunneling is not these. What's a lot more common is for specific domains. So now you can access specific, you can put in specific domains or applications that are allowed to split tunnel, which means, so for example, right, you can say like exclude, right? So if we do exclude domain, we say splat, .office365.com. Now anything destined for Office 365 will be excluded from the tunnel. So it will be split tunneled, which means that now Office 365, that user, even though they're connected to Global Protect, that Office 365 traffic will not go through the tunnel. So it will not hit the firewall. It will just go direct to the internet, if that makes sense. This is very, very common because sometimes certain applications such as Office 365 don't like it when you try to use some kind of a VPN. They don't like seeing that where you're coming from is different from where your machine is, etc. They just don't like that. And so you can add specific exclude domains if you trust those domains and you're okay with your users not accessing them through your VPN. This is very, very common. You can do the same thing with the client application. You can see here link. Oh my goodness, link. I haven't heard of link in a while. So you see link now. People use Teams. They don't use link, but link. Link. Jeez. All right. Teams would be a very, very, very common application to put here. So you would put Microsoft Teams because it's very, very common to split tunnel Microsoft Teams. There's actually a specific way to split tunnel video, which we will look into, where you can basically exclude video from going through the tunnel, but that'll be in a separate setting, and that is specific to that is across the entire gateway. So yeah, you can also put client application process names if they're specific application processes such as Teams that you do not want to go through the tunnel. On to network services. So per agent config, you can select a DNS server. Funnily enough, you can actually put this in a couple different places. I don't know why. You can do it in both. But you can put a DNS server here. So if you want, so for example, if you have a DNS server in your hub and when users connect in, you don't want them to be using DNS on their endpoint. You want them to receive a new DNS server that all their DNS requests are going through. Then you can put that DNS server's IP address or FQDN here. Why is this over here? Can I move this? Here we go. All right. So 10 dot. Put that's the default DNS. If you didn't know this, when you spin up a virtual private cloud in AWS, it's going to be that .1 will be your default gateway, and then the .2 they put a DNS server there. The more you know, you're learning about all kinds of things. You're welcome. DNS suffix. This is interesting. So if you want to add, for example, wesleycyber.me here, then if the user queries something like firewall, they say, if there's an NS lookup, or if they just try to go to firewall, it will automatically add this DNS suffix to anything where it's not a fully qualified domain name and it's just a host name. It will append this at the end. So that is what this does. So this is very common if you have your corporate environment and people are used to being able to put in kind of like unqualified, is that unqualified host names that aren't fully qualified, then because this thing is appended automatically, then this is a way that you can get that appended automatically once they connect into the VPN. All right. Now, I remember I said that you can configure the IP pool here, but you can also, I love zooming in and out. This is great. You can also configure it. Why is it here as well? What is going on? All right, so something that's interesting is you can configure it for the entire gateway, or you can configure it per agent client settings. But in the Palo Alto documentation, it says not to do both. What happens if you do both? Is there's something scary that happens? Well, you know, we like to break things. This is a demo firewall. So let's see. 182.168. Was it 182? Is that one? Yeah, okay. What number am I going to do? I don't know. Today is the 9th. All right, so we'll just do 9.0/24. What if I do this and then I hit OK? Error. Big error. The client IP pool and IP pools are mutually exclusive. Blah, blah, blah. So basically it doesn't allow you to do it. So I don't know. The documentation scares you, like you can't do both. But if you don't want to do it here, so if I go delete these. And you just want to do it across the whole gateway, you can do that. Now it will save. So you got to decide. Do you want to do it per client, agent client setting, or do you want to just do it across the whole gateway? It is for you to decide, not for me. I'm just showing you how the things work, and if you're just a network engineer studying for this certification, you just need to know how these things work. And this is how they work. You have 2 options. You can't do both. You gotta do one or the other. You decide. Moving on to network services, we have an inheritance source. It says none. If I do a drop down, nothing pops up. Why does nothing pop up? We might be wondering, what is an inheritance source? And you might be telling me, Wes, if I had inheritance, I wouldn't be studying for this certification. I would be on a beach, spending my inheritance at the beach, drinking some Corona. Okay, an inheritance source is you have to have DHCP or, according to the documentation, PPPoE, which I incorrectly in a previous video called Power over Ethernet, and it is point-to-point protocol over Ethernet. But you need to have one of those configured. And then if you configure either your firewall as a DHCP server or relay, or if you have PPPoE, let's say that 10 times fast, set up, then that will pop up here, and you can inherit your network services from that. Boom. Here you also have primary DNS. But wait a second, Wes, didn't you say you could push DNS here? Well, you can do it in multiple places. Aren't you happy? So you can push DNS to your clients either here or there. All right, you can also configure WINS. Now, I found out that WINS, which I can't remember what it stands for, Windows Internet Naming System. I don't think it's system. I think it's service. Windows Internet Naming Service. WINS, first of all, on Microsoft website, they call it a legacy protocol. And second of all, WINS is apparently no longer supported as of November of last year. So I'm just going to skip over that. All right. Inherent DNS suffixes. Didn't we just cover this? All right, well, you can configure that here as well. So there's a few things, such as the client IP pool and these network services that you can configure either in these per agent client config or for the whole gateway here. Let us move on. Connection settings. Honestly, these are all pretty intuitive, I think. Login lifetime. When you log in, how long do you want that lifetime to be? 30 days. All right, the lifetime's going to expire. How long do you want a notification? You want a notification 30 minutes ahead of time? There we go. What will the message be? You see where I'm going with this, right? If the user hasn't had any activity, in this case 3 hours, right? Minutes, yep, 3 hours. Are you going to automatically log them out? All right. This is all pretty straightforward. I'm not going to go super detailed on this. Let's look at these authentication cookies. So if you're using that authentication cookie, you can see that if in the portal, as it says here, if in the portal you have turned on automatic restoration of VPN connection, but you want to disable it for specific gateways, then you can select that here to disable that for specific gateways. Otherwise, you would control that in the portal. And then if you want to look at this with that whole like authentication cookie thing that we covered, if you want to restrict the authentication cookie usage so that this is pretty cool actually, so that the original source IP for where it was issued. So that basically means the user, once they have to be at the same source IP. So if they get that authentication cookie issued to them with one IP, so for example, they're at home, then they can't just take their laptop to a restaurant. They're going to get a new IP. That authentication cookie will not work anymore. They will need to basically log back in and generate a new authentication cookie for a login. You can also do it for source IP network range. Yeah, you can see you can even put the net mask there. But if you do the source IP network range, then that would be probably a lot more common if you're using some kind of a internal gateway and you wanted to basically, if someone's logging in internally and they're going to get an authentication cookie, then you can put the net mask for your internal IP range, so that then even if they move around, they get a different IP, but they're still within the internal network, they can still use that same authentication cookie. That makes sense. Video traffic. I promised you this, or we are close. We're close. So I know this is already a long video, but we are getting close. And as I told you, split tunneling. We covered that. The split tunneling is very, very important. And this is part of split tunneling. You can exclude video traffic from the tunnel, and you can even select the specific application. You might be wondering why the application's written like this. Why is there daily motion all lowercase? Well, there's this magical thing on the Palo Alto firewall called app ID, which is I believe one of the key features that makes a Palo Alto firewall different from other firewalls. And these are basically, these applications are being determined not based on the URL or the that's being accessed, or the IP that's being accessed, or the what is the other thing, or the port or whatever. These are actually, it's looking at the network traffic and it's able to figure out, hey, this is what the signature of a daily motion traffic looks like, and it's able to determine that. And so it does app ID. That's the magic of app ID, right? So if you want to, so say you have users who are doing, if your users are doing a lot of YouTube streaming for some reason in your organization, and you're totally fine with that, with them doing that on their corporate laptop, and you want to exclude that traffic from the tunnel because it's just streaming and you're not as concerned from a security perspective as streaming, and you're a lot more concerned with them taking up all of your bandwidth in your tunnel, then you can exclude the video traffic for YouTube or whatever other of these applications that your users might be using. So another form of split tunneling, it is split tunneling those specific applications. Boom, on to host information profile notifications. So we've talked a little bit about host information profiles. This is kind of what it sounds like. It's getting information about your host that you can actually use in security policies. You can say, hey, these, I want different security policies for Windows machines, or for machines that have specific certificates installed, or that have specific registry keys, etc. All this is again kind of an aesthetic thing. If you add a HIP, so a host information profile and this HIP notification, basically you can have a match message. So if a HIP profile matches, you can add it here. So you can say, I think you have to add, you have to actually add the object here. But if you have to add the object, so for example, say you have anti-malware is installed, virus definition. Okay, so just say like anti-malware installed. Then you can say match message. So if it's matching, then you can add something here that says, hey, you have a valid anti-malware software. Good for you. Woo! All right. And then you can put it in either the system tray balloon. Very important. No, it's aesthetic. As I mentioned, aesthetic stuff don't worry too much about. Or a pop-up message. Ooh, the balloon or the pop-up message. Not a big deal. And then you can also put if you want to do mobile apps, but again, don't worry too much about that. Not match message. So here's the opposite, right? So you do not have the proper anti-malware. Boo. All right, that's what that is. Really not that big of a deal. I wouldn't worry too much about that. Those aesthetic things, as I mentioned, are very unlikely to be a priority of anybody who I've met who will work on these certifications. Finally, moving on to the satellite, as we talked about in the previous video, this satellite configuration is for the large-scale VPN. You can also do a tunnel configuration. You can set up a different tunnel, right, interface specific for the satellite, and this will be if you have sort of these, like this hub and spoke architecture, where you have these spokes that are connecting into a hub, these spoke sort of firewalls that would be connecting into a hub, which would be hosting Global Protect. And then they're almost, those firewalls are almost acting like the users, but then it's like a VPN router. So all the users that are connected to that firewall will then be basically rerouted into the Global Protect gateway. So you can do this. Yeah, you can set up the same network settings, etc. How do I get this to populate? What's going on here? Oh, it doesn't like that. Let me uncheck this, by the way. How do I get this to populate? Do I have to? I probably have to. Oh. All right. Well, if I got this thing to, oh, maybe I have to select the tunnel interface here. Let's do 3. Haha, there we go. So that's what I had to do. So now you can see there's your inheritance. Again, no inheritance. That's why you're studying for this certification. Same thing, primary DNS, secondary DNS, it's inherited. I mean, this all, you've seen all this stuff before. Very similar. Same thing, you can set up an IP pool for those satellites that are connecting in, specific access routes if you want to do that. All right, so this is for that large scale VPN. Again, I'm not going to cover that in detail, but if that's something you want to see in a future video, you'd like to see a whole demonstration of large scale VPN, I am more than happy to do that. I'm just going to give you the basics of what these settings are and how large scale VPN works. So let's go away from the firewall now and back to my face that you guys apparently don't like to see, and that's why you want to see the firewall in full screen. But today we covered the gateways. We covered a lot of different settings. But remember, specifically, you're going to want to make sure you fully understand the split tunneling. So whether that is you're going to include or exclude specific subnets, but you're also going to be able to include or exclude specific domains that you're accessing, and and applications. I probably didn't cover this super well in there, but if you want to make sure that you're determining whether you want to do an include or exclude type policy. So if you are going to, if there's only specific things that you need the user to access, then you want to put those in include, and then that's it. But if you basically want everything to go through the tunnel except for other things, then you would put those in exclude. And that's very, very common to, again, put like Teams in exclude for the application, or to put like for the domains, to put like Office 365 or something like that in exclude for that domain, so that anything that's accessing that domain will be excluded from the tunnel. That's very, very common. So you kind of have to think like, do I want to try to push as much as possible through the tunnel, or do I want to limit what goes through the tunnel, basically only push things through the tunnel that need to go through? And that's kind of how you have to think about split tunneling. But in general, just remember the basic configurations of the gateway. A lot of them are pretty similar to the portal configurations, at least the general setup. So a lot of this was review from yesterday as well. In the next video, I will be talking about site-to-site tunnels. We'll be setting up some site-to-site tunnels. And again, this was the last video on Global Protect. If you do want to see a video on large-scale VPN, how to set all of that up, I can make a video just on large-scale VPN. It may or may not be part of this series. It might just be more of a standalone lesson. But for now, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.